What do you know about Mongolia? Most likely you know it's an Asian country bordered by China and Russia. Maybe you've heard it has a lot of plains. But hardly anyone realizes just how big Mongolia actually is. And it's indeed massive. Its territory is so vast that it can stretch across Eastern Europe from the western edge of the Netherlands all the way to Russia, and span from the Baltic to the Adriatic Sea. Mongolia is so huge it could cover California and several nearby states like Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and Colorado. Basically, it's only a bit smaller than Alaska and more than twice the size of Texas. Stretching 1,486 miles from west to east and at its widest 782 miles from north to south, Mongolia ranks among the 20 largest countries in the world. It holds, depending on the count, the 18th or 20th spot. Moreover, it's the largest landlocked country in the world. No seas, nothing at all. But all these lands are empty with just a few exceptions, even though there's so much talk about overpopulation these days. To get why Mongolia's endless plains are hardly used by people, I'll need a cup of coffee. Just a little reminder for those who forget to hit the like button, don't forget to do it after watching or even while you're at it. And thanks to you know what. All right then. So Mongolia is a really big country. So in theory, there could be tens of millions of people living there, but as of 2024, it's estimated that around 3.5 million people live there. So in terms of land size, Mongolia ranks 18th, but in terms of population, it's a whopping 131st. These 3.5 million people mean that in just about any major city in the world, there are more people than in all of Mongolia. In Tokyo alone, there are 4 times more people than in Mongolia. New York's population is roughly equal to that of 2 Mongolias. If we keep comparing, then 3.5 million people is almost as much as the population of the whole city of Berlin, but we're still talking about a big country. The population density in Mongolia is 2 people per 0.4 square miles, and that's really low. If you compare, and comparing helps you see the whole picture better, Mongolia is about 1/3 less populated than the next most densely populated countries, Australia and Namibia. That's why in the list of countries by population density, Mongolia is at the very bottom. Only Greenland is below it, but there are less than 60,000 people living there. Moreover, if all the residents of Mongolia were spread evenly across the country, they probably wouldn't even be able to meet. They'd just see each other from a distance. Fortunately, the way Mongolians live is nothing like that. Ulaanbaatar, the capital and largest city, is home to about half of the country's population. I mean, literally, 1.6 million people live there. It's a pretty old city that was founded in 1639 as a nomadic Buddhist monastic center. After that, it changed locations 28 times and finally settled in its current spot in 1778. Besides Ulaanbaatar, there are other cities in Mongolia, but there aren't really that many. If we talk about places with more than 7,500 people living in them, there are only 29 of those. There are certainly others, but they're really tiny, and together they add up to about 300. Just to clarify, 300 cities in an area the size of Eastern Europe. Let's take any other country in Eastern Europe, like Poland. There are over 1,000 cities on its territory. Can you feel the difference? And this is just the beginning. About 30 to 40% of Mongolia's population leads a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle. In other words, people either live in cities or other settlements, or they're nomads. If we're talking about the capital, Ulaanbaatar covers just 1.8 square miles. That's less than 1% of all of Mongolia's territory, and a big chunk of the country's population is focused here. Basically, about 99.7% of Mongolia is uninhabited, and there are definitely reasons for that. Most of the country is covered in grassy steppe, with mountains in the north and west and the Gobi Desert in the south, and you hardly ever come across people anywhere. The western part is made up entirely of high-altitude areas, which of course aren't really suited for living. Remember I mentioned that Mongolia is landlocked? Well, there's no access to other large bodies of water either, and that's one of the main reasons the territory is so barren. Another reason is the harsh weather conditions, including dry, extremely cold fronts that come in from Siberia and make winters in Mongolia incredibly tough. It's no surprise, though a bit unexpected, that Ulaanbaatar is considered the coldest capital in the world. This is all due to its high elevation, relatively high latitude, being hundreds of miles from any coastline and the influence of the Siberian anticyclone. It has a short, though hot, summer, but a very cold, dry winter. The lowest temperatures in January typically occur just before sunrise, ranging from -32 to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Speaking of the scorching summer, it's just incredibly hot in Mongolia. You often get exhausting temperatures around 104 degrees Fahrenheit. You can partly thank the mountains that surround Mongolia for this, making it one of the countries with the clearest, sunniest days in the world. On average, Mongolia has 257 cloudless days a year. Just like the western part with its mountains, the south of Mongolia is totally empty too. It's just how things turned out historically. People never really settled here because it's always been way too tough of a challenge. It's so hard to survive here that it's almost impossible. Not even the camels, which the nomadic Mongols rely on a lot, make much of a difference. So to keep it simple and not drown you in geographic details, I'll just say that people stick to areas in the country that are basically livable. And if there aren't people around, it probably means living there isn't really doable. Or it might be, but it requires a ton of resources and motivation with no real benefits. That's why parts of Mongolia are simply deserted. However, it's not just about the chilly winters, sweltering summers, and winds. There's another reason: the soil. Across Mongolia, due to the brutally cold winters, a huge part of the territory is constantly covered in snow. The summers aren't long enough for the ground to thaw. This phenomenon is called permafrost in geology. Moreover, Mongolia ranks 5th in the size of permafrost coverage after Russia, Canada, China, and the USA. Even the capital is in a zone of broken permafrost, which means building here is a challenge, just because the ground temperature in such a place changes less throughout the year than the air temperature. Plus, in some places there's permafrost and in others there isn't. Building in permafrost areas is one of the toughest challenges for engineers and construction companies, not just because you have to cut through the frost, drive in piles, and set up the foundation. If the permafrost under the building starts to thaw, the foundation will begin to sink and the building will fall apart. And considering that global warming is in full swing, predicting the thawing of permafrost becomes even trickier. So building becomes an issue as well. Not to mention that in a cold climate, buildings need to be heated, and if the design is poor or the maintenance is lacking, it can lead to repeated cycles of thawing and freezing in the ground. This will cause it to heave, and then you'll get landslides and building damage. But building structures in the wrong conditions isn't enough. If you want people to move in, you also have to provide them with food, and that access has to be steady. That's why farms around the globe occupy a lot of land, helping the population of the planet expand and spread out. But in Mongolia, with its permanent frost, there can't be any talk of farms, and even where the soil warms up, there are its own problems. Mainly, they come down to the fact that there's just not much growing in this soil. Either it's too salty or it's rocky deposits, meaning soil with small stones that can't be cultivated. The high altitude, extreme temperature swings, long winters, and low rainfall make the potential for agriculture, let's say, very limited. The growing season, which is the time plants have to grow and develop, is only about 95 to 110 days. Overall, only wheat, barley, and potatoes really have enough time. Due to all these reasons, the agricultural sector mainly focuses on nomadic herding. 75% of the land is set aside for pastures, while only 3% of the population does farming. Probably the most desperate folks in all of Mongolia. By the way, they're kind of going against tradition since livestock have long provided Mongolians with food and clothing. Plus, the need to care for livestock is tied to the nomadic way of life. The vegetation is sparse everywhere, so to feed the animals, they have to keep moving from place to place. Nomads did it before, and they still do it now. Life in the city and in the countryside in Mongolia is strikingly different. The capital, Ulaanbaatar, is a modern metropolis with glass and concrete skyscrapers. There are shopping malls, movie theaters, cafes, museums, and hotels, basically just an ordinary city. Meanwhile, nomads raising livestock, just like they have for centuries, roam the steppe with their herds and live in felt gurs. Mongolia is home to one of the few truly nomadic cultures left in the world. About a fifth of the population are herders, and the nomadic lifestyle is closely tied to the country's traditions. But modern life is quickly catching up with people, even in the steppes. Modern nomads have a connection to the outside world, at least they have phones with internet access. To charge their gadgets, they use generators or solar panels. Over the course of 3,000 years, the Mongolian yurt hasn't changed much. It's made of a wooden frame covered with felt on top. The only modern touch is the tarp that protects the yurts from moisture and wind. Since the design is classic and has stood the test of time, it takes about 30 minutes to take it apart. Putting it together takes a bit longer and is more complicated, around 45 minutes to an hour. But that's still pretty quick, because in the end, you basically have a whole house. Besides specially designed homes for constant moving, nomads have family pastures that they travel across throughout the year to ensure their animals always have food. During the year, a nomad changes camp at least 4 times. Often, these camps are hundreds of miles away from the nearest settlements or cities, just in the middle of nowhere. And it's a bit inconvenient in the modern world. Since the Mongols move from place to place, you can't really assign a permanent address to a yurt, so the country has its own address system, a code made up of letters and numbers. This code is assigned to every object in the country, and you can find it using geolocation. Given that nomads have tech, it's not too hard to do. Unlike their ancient ancestors, modern herders roam the steppe not on horseback, but in trucks. They pack up their yurt and personal stuff into the pickup, which slowly rolls along behind the herd. Technology has also reached animals. Many of them, especially valuable breeds like horses, camels, and cattle, have microchips implanted that can be tracked using satellite services. Shepherds are also increasingly using drones. You could probably call them true digital nomads. But among these people, there are still those who survive off their herds, living solely on milk and meat. Well, and their byproducts, but of course there are only a handful of those nomads left. And then I thought that I need to mention something important. Such a low population density in Mongolia hasn't always been the case. I mean, it's clear that the Mongolians have lived in harsh conditions and moved around a lot, which doesn't help the population grow, but there used to be more people here anyway. Mongolia became fully independent from foreign powers only in the early 20th century. Before that, it was under the rule of the Qing dynasty for 200 years. During all those years, the population of the country constantly shrank due to famine, executions, and other upheavals that happen to people when they're under imperial control. There were uprisings too. Scientists estimate that around 80% of the 600,000 Mongols were wiped out after they revolted against the Qing rule in 1755. Then there was the USSR. In short, there were plenty of horrors, and modern Mongolia is still recovering from everything that's happened in its past. It looks like the situation isn't going to improve anytime soon. I mean, we shouldn't expect Mongolia to suddenly start getting populated, because the nomadic lifestyle is, of course, a legacy and a way to keep traditions alive. But it's getting harder to maintain it every year. What the Mongols call Zud is happening more often now. Icy winds blast across the steppe, leaving a thick frost that prevents animals from getting to the grass. Temperatures drop below minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and livestock that are already weak from hunger simply freeze to death. Even animals that are penned up during the Zud can die from suffocation while trying to stay warm. This natural disaster can take out millions of animals. Back in 1944, there was a record loss of nearly 7 million livestock. But just recently, during the winter of 2009-2010, that horrifying record was surpassed. The United Nations reported that 8 million, or around 17% of all livestock in the country, were lost. And this is happening more and more often. Not too long ago, Zuds happened once or twice a decade. Now it's almost every year. And people are finding it harder to see the point in continuing their nomadic lifestyle. It's easier to sell everything and move to the city, which means making Mongolia even more deserted. Besides, climate change and bad management are destroying Mongolia's pastures, 90% of which are affected by desertification. The steppes are just losing their vegetation. The temperature in Mongolia has risen by 4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1940, which is much higher than the global average, while the yearly amount of rainfall is sharply decreased. This shift has brought drier summers followed by brutally cold winters, making it harder for animals to find food. Hundreds of thousands of nomads have already left their herds, moving to the city, and young Mongolians, seeing their parents' hardships, rarely want to herd cattle. School kids dream of becoming teachers, cops, and doctors instead of herders, and considering how tough that work is, it's hard to blame them. The unlikely killer. As you probably guessed, it's not just empty in Mongolia, it's also cold, really cold. But hardly anyone expected that the winter of 2015-2016 would be so brutal. Back then, the temperature dropped to minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit, which led to catastrophic consequences. Back then, the Dzud caused a massive number of animals to die, including sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. According to the UN, over 850,000 animals died because of the harsh winter, and that's saying something, since they're pretty much built to handle cold weather. But it's important to note that it's not just the cold that's to blame. Due to the drought that has been going on in the region leading up to the freeze, the animals were dealing with a food shortage along the northern borders of the country, which left them weak as they headed into winter. It's estimated that Dzud has caused the death of over 20 million animals since 2000. One might think that global warming isn't a threat to Mongolia at all, even though these harsh winters are one of its signs. The problem is made worse by the fact that it's hard to predict the onset of a Dzud, so you can't really prepare for the cold. You have to adapt and survive, or leave the steppe and head to the city in search of a better life. Tent city. Even though winters in Mongolia are incredibly cold, the Mongolians still don't want to live in regular houses despite the authorities' efforts. What could be better than a soft couch and a cozy blanket? In the eyes of the people of Mongolia, it's the same thing, just in a yurt. And it's great if there are lots of yurts nearby, a whole city. Locals say they really love their home. It's a quiet spot at the foot of the mountains where nature's always close by. A few decades ago, you could rarely see anyone here besides shepherds with their flocks. Now about 800,000 people live here. And this is despite the lack of drinking water, sewage, and heating. But how do yurt dwellers survive in winter? Especially when the thermometer drops to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and below? Well, people have to burn coal, rubber, and plastic to keep warm. Yes, you heard that right, rubber and plastic. Anyone who's seen these materials burn is likely squirming at the thought. Such heating methods, in turn, lead to the release of toxic substances and make Ulaanbaatar one of the cities with the worst air quality as confirmed by the World Health Organization. And once again, the harsh climate is to blame. Many of those who've moved to this area used to be livestock herders. During the winter of 2010, a Dzud hit, resulting in the loss of around 10 million animals. This made thousands of nomads leave the steppes and settle in the yurt area. Every week, more yurts pop up, and it's estimated that the area gains about 40,000 new residents each year. Building boom. When you think about it, Mongolia is quite an unusual country. There's a lot of empty space. People aren't into living in apartments, but the cities are still growing, and they're growing pretty fast. For example, in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, skyscrapers are pushing out traditional yurts. This is linked to the economic boom thanks to coal mining, which has brought the country double-digit growth rates. The coal industry, making up a quarter of Mongolia's GDP in 2022, has spurred demand for office spaces and quality housing in Ulaanbaatar. But there's a bit of a problem here. The rapid increase in the capital's population from 500,000 in the 1990s to 2 million people has led to some unexpected consequences. People are struggling to move around the city because of traffic jams, which can keep them stuck for hours on their way to and from work, and kids are finding it tough to have places to play with all the new apartment buildings going up. On top of that, there isn't enough space for new schools and hospitals. In short, it's an urban living crisis, plain and simple. But are they actually going to do anything about it? It seems so. The mayor of Ulaanbaatar put a moratorium on issuing permits for new construction until 2040, except for schools. However, this restriction doesn't apply to projects approved before, which leads to ongoing construction all over the city, and the yurt city is also expanding. Kashmir is devastating Mongolia. All the problems I've already mentioned are being topped off with another, rather surprising one. The population in Mongolia is decreasing because of Cashmir. Remember that roughly a third of Mongolia's population, which is around 3.5 million people, is involved in raising livestock. They roam the grasslands searching for fresh pastures for their animals. Blah, 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 you get the idea. But like I mentioned, Mongolia is dealing with a major ecological crisis. Its expansive steppes are going through desertification. Because of this problem, a lot of herders have to abandon their traditional lifestyle. And then China comes in with its demand for Cashmere. And it's not just any demand, they want a ton of Cashmere, which has driven the prices way up. This has led Mongolian herders to start buying a lot of goats. And goats, which feed on roots and seeds, have a much more destructive impact on the grasslands compared to sheep and cattle. So you see the problem, right? The grasslands are already disappearing, and goats just speed up that process, leaving no food for other animals and forcing herders to abandon their flocks. But despite that, Mongolian herders really started to rely on the income from Cashmere sales. Not like they have much choice. Yurt for rent. But let's finally take a break from problems and think about something nice. For example, about traveling. Have you been to Mongolia? Me neither, but after this news, you'll probably want to visit it. Airbnb has a one-of-a-kind offering, a traditional Mongolian yurt in a secluded spot. Inside the tent, you'll find 2 wooden beds and sleeping bags, as well as a stove for cooking up mainly meat and noodle dishes. This quirky accommodation can be booked for 2 to 3 nights, and there's another tent nearby where the host family stays. Yes, this experience isn't for those who can't give up regular comforts. There's no bath or toilet in the yurt, and the furniture and decor, well, they fit the overall vibe, but they feed you well. 3 meals a day are provided, plus guests are invited to join in on daily activities, including herding reindeer. And the yurt, just like its owners, is always on the move. So are you ready to make a reservation? You owe me exactly 1 like. See you later.